Okay, so let's continue our investigation of various stellar parameters. Left you last time with a little sort of thought question, really. We've been looking at the spectral types of different types of star. The idea that you can use them to, you can use the pattern of spectral lines to classify the temperature of the star. We introduced this notation of spectral type with the various letters. O, B, A, F, G, K, M. And the A stars, they were the first ones, really an obvious category to classify because they have this very distinctive pattern here. You can see the Balmer lines, but then this drop in the continuum level here, up below 360 nanometers. So I was asking you to sort of think a little bit about what's happening in this part of the spectrum here. You can see that, if you continued the line of the continuum here, then it, you should be up here somewhere, but suddenly there's a big drop here. Okay. So what's happening? You can see that the Balmer lines are getting closer and closer together here. Okay. So as you go up through the sequence, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, etc., they're getting closer and closer together. And if we go over again back to our hydrogen energy level diagram, here's the Balmer series. Okay, so H alpha, beta, gamma, delta. So again, the energy level is getting closer and closer as we go further into the blue, as the energy gap gets larger. You're going more towards the spectral lines in the blue. And of course, they're going to get closer and closer together until you end up, up here at kind of n equals infinity, effectively. So the lines will get very, very close together. And if you go further than this point, then your photons are suddenly going to have enough energy to ionize hydrogen. Okay. So that's the key to really what's happening here. Okay, once you get past that point where all the Balmer lines converge together, which occurs around this 360 nanometer wavelength, then the photons with energy up here, no matter what their wavelength, would then suddenly have enough energy to ionize hydrogen straight out of the n equals 2 level. So an electron here would jump all the way up into the continuum, effectively up here. So at this point, all your photons, no matter what wavelength they are, if they come across a hydrogen atom in the n equals 2 level, they're going to ionize it, or more than likely to ionize it. So that explains that kind of drop there. And of course, in these 10,000 Kelvin stars, that's the surface temperature of these A-type stars, then you've got a lot of photons around that wavelength as well, because it's kind of where the peak is as well. If you go back to Wien displacement law, 10,000 Kelvin, the peak will be at 300 nanometers. Or it should be, if it was a black body. Okay, so that's that one. Okay, so as I say, we've introduced this idea of spectral type. So again, this was, early part of the 1900s was when this was sort of developed, and all the way through the 20th century, spectral classification was a big thing. And today we'll look at the next sort of major use of that kind of new knowledge, as it were, once the idea that a temperature sequence, that the spectral sequence was a temperature sequence, people started to plot the main topic of this lecture, which is called a HR diagram, or Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. Okay. And that will lead us into the idea of ranges of masses, main sequence lifetime, and the whole idea that stars don't live forever, but they evolve and die eventually. Okay, so let me just move straight on to define what a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram actually is. Okay, so it's basically a graph. Okay, so if you've got a whole bunch of stars and you've studied them, measured their brightnesses, distances, and their spectral types, then you can then plot quantities against each other. And we introduced these quantities in the last couple of lectures. So capital MV here is the absolute magnitude of the star. So remember, you need to know the distance to the star for that. So that we're going to discuss that coming up in workshop 2, how you measure the distance. But let's, at the moment, just take it for read that the distance is known to these stars. So you know the absolute magnitude. So that's a measure of its intrinsic sort of brightness, if you like. Okay. Nothing to do with whether it's near or far away. And plot that against spectral type. Okay, so whether it's an O, a B, an A, etc. type stuff. So that would be, there are sort of several versions of the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. I'm sort of picking out 2 of these here. Okay, so that I would call this one like an observer's version. Okay, so you measure the absolute magnitude, you measure the spectral type, and you just plot one against the other. Okay. A more theorist's version, as I would call it, would be to plot, the actual physical parameters of the stars that these variables represent. Okay, so absolute magnitude is really a measure of the intrinsic power of the star, so that's luminosity. And spectral type, as we know already now, is a measure of the effective temperature, the surface temperature of the star. So theorists would plot luminosity versus effective temperature. Observers will plot absolute magnitude versus spectral type. But effectively, you get the same answer in that instead of getting basically a kind of scatter plot where you'd have stars all over this diagram randomly distributed, that's not what happens. You get very distinctive patterns emerging. Okay, and a key thing about science is if that you see a pattern somewhere, there's usually some physics behind it to explain it. And that's very much the case here. So these Hertzsprung-Russell diagrams are telling us something very important about the types of stars out there. So they're called Hertzsprung-Russell diagrams. So 2 astronomers sort of independently came across this way of displaying data on stars. Hertzsprung-Russell is a bit of a mouthful, so HR diagrams for short is usually the term you will hear. So let's have an example of one of these. Okay, so this one is for some bright stars. So that should say bright stars at the bottom. So these are, pretty much naked eye stars, some of which we've met already. Obviously, we've got our own sun on here. We've got Vega on here. We've got Sirius, the brightest star in the sky here. We've got Betelgeuse, the star I've used in a few examples problems already. So these are just bright stars. Okay. And let's look at the theorists' axes first, if you like. So here's luminosity, okay, and here is effective temperature. Now, something you'll immediately notice, or surface temperature, whichever you like, is that the temperature scale is plotted the wrong way around. Okay. So temperature is increasing to the left and not increasing to the right. Okay. And that's because historically, then, the spectral sequence is plotted this way around, with starting with hot stars and finishing with the cooler stars. So that's why these diagrams appear this way around. Okay. But don't worry about that. Well, worry about it, you need to remember it, but that's the reason. So it's a log-log plot, okay? So this is log of luminosity here, so these are going up in orders of magnitude, many orders of magnitude, as you can see. This is the range of luminosities here. So the sun has obviously got 1 solar luminosity, so everything is scaled to the sun here. And in terms of temperature, here the sun is obviously at 6,000 Kelvin or thereabouts, okay, in the middle of the range. Okay, so it goes from 3,000 as the lowest up to about 30,000 or 40,000 up here at the high end. Okay. So in terms of a graph of physical variables, a HR diagram is a plot temperature going backwards against luminosity. But as I say, historically, then it started more as a plot on these other axes here. You've got your spectral classes down the bottom, O, B, A, F, G, K, M. Some of the numerical subdivisions here as well. And you've got absolute magnitude up and down here on the right-hand axis. Again, remember that the magnitude scale is also a bit counterintuitive. Smaller numbers and negative numbers mean brighter objects. larger magnitudes mean a fainter object. Okay. And so recall that a difference of 5 magnitudes, as in here, corresponds to a factor of 100 in brightness. And you can see that 5 magnitudes on the absolute magnitude scale corresponds roughly to a factor of 100 on the luminosity scale, as you'd hope it would. Okay. Okay, so those are the axes. But now, let's look at where the dots, so each dot represents a different star, and you can see that, again, it's not a scatter plot. So most stars lie on this sort of rough diagonal from the top left to the bottom right. Okay, so you can see that sequence of stars there, but again, we'll come back to sequence is not the best name perhaps, but I would call it a locus. Okay, so you've got a line joining a whole bunch of points here. Then you've got other regions of this diagram where there are quite a lot of stars populating as well. So there's a clear grouping of stars over here, which are red and reasonably luminous, certainly more luminous than these ones. You've got another bunch of stars scattered all across the top of the diagram, so all very luminous. Okay. And then you've got another little sort of locus of points here, forming a straight line pretty much down here. Okay. So quite hot, but not very luminous. Okay. So those were some bright stars in the naked eye stars, effectively. So that's not going to be a particularly representative sample of all stars. These are just, sort of ones that, a lot of them do happen to be near the Earth because that's why they're bright. So let's go to a more representative sample. Sorry, this diagram's a bit more, not so nice looking, but tells us more what we need to know, which is why I've chosen it. So this is a Hertzsprung-Russell diagrams for sort of all stars in the solar neighborhood. So what does that mean? So it means sort of basically trying to put on this plot all stars out to a certain distance from the sun. So, could be several hundred parsecs, something like that. And you just plot all the stars in that volume of space. So that then is much more representative of the whole population of stars as a whole, rather than just picking out some nice ones that happen to be bright here on the Earth. And so the same patterns emerge, and now we have some labeling. So you've still got this sequence of stars going from top left all the way down through with a bit of a curve in it, down to the bottom right. And this is labeled as the main sequence, okay, because it's the main place where you find stars, basically. There's more stars on here than anywhere else in the diagram. We've got a lot of these stars up here, which, as we shall see in a moment, we will refer to as red giants. And you've got the stars across the top, and those are referred to as supergiants. And then these ones down here, so this line of stars in the bottom left diagonal really, are referred to as white dwarf stars. Again, got the same axes, temperature against luminosity. Okay, so let's put some words on that. So being familiar with locations on the HI diagram are important. Okay. So most stars lie on the main sequence, so often just written as MS for short. So that's that diagonal from top left to bottom right. The red giants are up on the right-hand side, which is the red part of the diagram, meaning they are cool. Okay, so we've learned that a few times now. If stars have a red color, then it just means, because they're emitting like black bodies, it means they're at the cool end of the temperature range. And the thing to note here is that they lie above that main sequence locus. Then we've got the supergiants, not many of them, they're quite rare, but they're all the way across the top of the diagram. Okay, so very luminous stars, covering a range of temperatures from cool to hot. And then the other main grouping is this white dwarf sequence. So white dwarfs. So they're called white because they're basically hot. And again, the naked eye does not really tend to pick up blue colors. So that's more like white hot is a way of thinking about it. So that's why they're called white. They're referred to as white dwarfs, and they lie below the main sequence. Okay. So perhaps the next thing we want to explore a little bit is, why are we calling some stars giants and other stars dwarfs? So it's obviously something to do with their size, with their radius. Okay. So you can solve this problem for yourself as to why they're named like this. Okay. So so a little problem for you to work on during the break is to look at this problem. Okay. So consider two stars that both have the same temperature, say around 3000 Kelvin. So on the far right-hand side of our diagram over here, let's consider one of them to be a red giant up here, and the other one to be a white dwarf all the way down here. Sorry, not a white dwarf at all, I'm talking rubbish. A red dwarf, okay. So again, a faint star all the way down here on the main sequence. Okay. So we've got two stars that are connected by this sort of line here on the HR diagram. So what we want to know is, how many times larger is this star compared to this star down here? Okay, so they've both got the same temperature, 3000 Kelvin, as you can see there. But one is, much higher up on the HR diagram than the other one. So why does being up here mean that it is larger in its radius? Okay. So have a look back through your notes, and what is it? What formula relates luminosity, temperature, and radius? Okay. And again, you don't need to put in absolute numbers here. We only want a ratio. So how many times larger is this star than this star? Okay, so again, you can just do a scaling here to work that out. What's the proportionality? It's important here. Okay, so go and look that up and have a go and see what number you come up with. And hopefully then you will know why these are called giants and things down here are called dwarfs. Okay, I'll see you after the break.